Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks so much for joining us during Black History Month for the Race and Justice Imperative, our annual event featuring conversations with some of our nation's most prominent black leaders. First, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, for its support of today's conversations. On the program today, we're going to examine if the nation is moving in the right direction. There's a lot to consider. Are we doing a better job of dismantling systemic racism? And what does systemic racism look like today? What did it look like 20 years ago? Are we centering Black Americans and communities of color in our policies and decision-making for real? And are we building a society that values diversity and inclusivity? I'm especially happy to be joined by my new, very cool colleague, Raquel Martin, Washington correspondent for Nexstar Media Group. Nexstar is our parent. It's the mothership. And I'm really happy to have you here. Thank you so much. She's going to help to lead with a big chunk of these conversations. So Raquel, thank you. We're going to have a good time. We've got some terrific speakers lined up, so stick around for the entire program. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillBHM. We are broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, I laugh at this. You could experience occasional trouble with your video. Don't throw your computer out the window. Just refresh the page and they tell me it will all be great. Never works for me, but I hope it does for you. Our first guest is Rashad Robinson. He is so famous, so great. Activist and president of Color of Change, an organization that works with corporations and the government to fight racial injustice in politics, culture, the workplace, and the economy. Rashad, we have talked in the past. It's so great to see you again. It's been many years since I was at the Atlantic way back then. Look, I know that Color of Change was created almost 17 years ago, as I understand it. So you're almost at your 17th birthday. And I guess the big question, which is perhaps an unfair one, is how do you know when you've actually begun to see real change? How do you begin? Because I think that a lot of what we're talking about today is that there's posture. Sometimes people appear, like there's change. But, fundamentally, how do you know you've achieved traction and we can begin kind of marking some progress? We have you muted, Rashad, I think. There we go.
For us at Color of Change, one of the things we're very clear about is not mistaking presence for power. Visibility and awareness, retweets, shout outs from the stage are sometimes the things that oftentimes have a lot of currency. It can make us feel like something is happening. But for us at Color of Change, we really think about rule change. Power is the ability to change the rules. And so it's not that presence isn't a good thing. It's not that our stories on the front page of the paper aren't important. It's that we can't mistake that for actually making real change. And we have seen so much visibility around racial justice issues, but that doesn't mean we've actually seen rule change. And so across corporations, across media, and of course government, how we really hold ourselves accountable and how we really hold the standard for what change looks like is when do we actually change the rules, change the dynamics for how things are done, and change the structures of accountability. And I think about that across all the different issues that impact our lives.
Rashad, we're hopefully talking to a lot of people that are coming to this relatively new, because I look at any successful effort's going to involve, bringing along new bedfellows, bringing on new folks to kind of be part of this. And I don't know exactly how to frame this, so I'm going to try. We've been in kind of COVID territory for 2 years, but we've also seen during this period the George Floyd's murder, Ahmaud Arbery's murder, and we see crises, just as when Color of Change was created after the Katrina hurricane and the impact on New Orleans, again, how communities of color were disproportionately impacted. I just wonder, as an activist and someone who talks to Washington and the nation, is it good to be centered around crises and critical crises moments, or are there positive agenda items that can also be demonstrative and also be compelling? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I mean, I actually think it has to be a mix of all of those things. I mean, I think that the fact of the matter is when moments of crisis, moments of pain happen, those are times when people are paying attention, right? And in 2020, when many people thought the best we could do in terms of activism was clap outside of windows or uplift investigative journalism, it was racial justice that drove people to the streets, drove multiracial coalitions of people to actually ask for more, pushed corporations to say that Black Lives Matter, and to do all of these sort of statements. And part of what we have to do is civil rights, racial justice infrastructure, is lay the groundwork to keep that energy going when the attention starts to fade. And so part of what we've tried to do is create initiatives that are not simply rooted in the sort of statement of the day, but are rooted in actually moving these institutions forward. And so our work, our change industry work, which is focused on, Hollywood, the music industry, and fashion, which has created roadmaps for these industries to move forward. Our beyond the statement work, which is focused on tech and focused on financial industries, which are, once again, roadmaps, but also demanding racial equity audits and pushing these companies around their policies. And then the work that we're doing every single day in communities around the country in working to hold district attorneys accountable, but also working with the district attorneys that we've helped to elect to help advance deeper understandings of safety and justice, where we can make sure that we are dealing with all the ways in which we over-incarcerate in this country, while also making sure we keep our communities safe, because we are finding solutions that move beyond incarceration. We are reimagining public safety. So for us, these moments happen where more people pay attention. But if we are just playing whack-a-mole with these moments, then we're not actually doing the work to actually move things forward. Over 7 million members are part of Color of Change right now. And that is a result, unfortunately, of a lot of crisis, of people looking for ways to get involved, looking to make their voices heard. But what I hope is that we keep those people involved and activated so that every single day we're finding ways to push the ball forward.
Tell us a little bit more about your tech focus, their big tech focus as one of the big priorities of Color of Change. And I ask you, just last week, I met with the chairman and CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, and over other things. So they're trying to, acquire Activision Blizzard, and it's going to be a huge tech. But they said, look, we see regulation coming. We don't want to fight it. We want to work with it. But in this environment where I think a lot of the technology industry sees regulation and oversight coming, what would be part of the dashboard that you would have of things that need to be fixed and corrected?
They all say that they see it coming and they don't want to fight it, but they're doing everything they actually can to fight it. And they're fighting it behind the scenes while saying publicly that they want it. They're, padding members of Congress's pockets through lobbyists and trying to make sure that whatever legislation comes in place will actually benefit the companies that have already won, the companies that are already here, make it harder for a lot of new companies to enter the market that will actually create the type of competition that we need, that will benefit all of our consumers, that will benefit users. And so one of the things that is really important to us at Color of Change is true antitrust legislation, legislation that actually holds these companies accountable. Another thing that is important for us is dealing with the ways in which these companies have immunity, especially the social media platforms. So reform of Section 230 is incredibly important. One of the things I think a lot about is sort of Standard Oil. I think about sort of the big companies that had to be regulated in the past. I think about when I go into a supermarket, why our meat is safe, or when I go and sit in a car, why those seatbelts work. And it's because there are rules of the road, not because of the altruism of those companies. It's because there's accountability. And so many of the rules that sort of govern big tech were created before we could even imagine what we're facing right now. So the technology that can bring us into the future is unfortunately dragging us into the past. And we've got to actually make sure that we have 21st century rules to deal with 21st century problems. I recently co-chaired the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder. Information disorder is one of those problems that sort of impacts all other problems we have in public life, whether it's the way in which information disorder impacts public health, ways in which sort of information disorder impacts our democracy or impacts the information we have about each other, the ways in which it can sort of advance violence, be sort of part of why we ended up where we ended up January 6th and even in the lead up to it. So for us at Color of Change, we have to make sure these companies, which have benefited so much from our democracy, which have benefited so much from our economy, don't continue to extract without being accountable for all the ways in which they impact our lives.
So Rashad, what's your gut feeling on that? I mean, this is something I discussed with a lot of senators and congressmen, but to tell you the truth, I don't know where they're really at. I can't tell you where the Biden administration really is at when it comes down to what you said, presence is not power, right? So what is your gut right now as you interact with the Biden administration? Are they faking support for you, or are they actually engaged in trying to get some of the change you're talking about with regards to monopolies, regulation of the tech sector, social media platforms?
I mean, I do believe that they are being honest when they say they want a path forward. They recognize that change needs to happen. What I worry about is that they have an kind of an old view of how we actually get there, that they believe that they can get everyone around the table and look people in the eye and shake people's hands and somehow come to some sort of solution. And we saw that on the Build Back Better plan. We saw that on voting rights. And I think what we, have to really understand is that when you talk about issues that impact communities that have been historically targeted, attacked, and exploited, communities that have constantly been at the sort of receiving end of so much of the pain, we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have the people lined up at the front door. And so for the Biden administration, for our friends in Congress, I think we have to recognize that we are not going to win if we don't actually push hard, if we don't challenge those who are enabling, and that if we don't recognize that as much as there are going to be some people who say they're our friends, they're going to be doing everything possible to keep the status quo in place because the status quo has benefited them. And so, a lot of what we are trying to do here is to create the cultural conditions for more people to recognize why these problems exist, who is to blame, and how we actually have to come together to overcome the barriers to change. And so, I know that there are some that believe that we can just get the social media giants sort of around the table and come to some sort of conclusion. And as someone who spent a lot of time doing that, having a lot of meetings at Facebook and Twitter and Google, and being in those meetings, sometimes having to go to those meetings even after folks like the New York Times exposed that while we were meeting with Facebook, they had hired a right-wing policy shop, PR firm, to lodge attacks at us, and hired this firm to sort of attack us while we thought we were at the table negotiating. We went through a whole civil rights audit with Facebook, only to watch them not implement so much of their own audit. We recognize that there are deep barriers to making this type of change because at the end of the day, these companies care about the bottom line. They care about growth and profit. And until we put in laws and regulations in place that make our safety and make the integrity of the information one of those things that can thwart their growth and thwart their profit, then we will continue to be in the situation that we're in.
Let me just ask one more question. This is, probably badly constructed, but I'm really enjoying this. And I think these are great moments to sort of learn on how we frame and talk about race, division, experience. When I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and my friend who's a poet, Kevin Young, just is the new director there. The truth is, I didn't know much about something like the 1921 Tulsa Massacre. There's a lot about the Black experience in America that I didn't know, just ignorant of. And I think a lot of Americans are there, in that space. And I'm just sort of interested in how we take the lived experience of systemic discrimination in America and give on-ramps to others who haven't had that experience so that there's empathy, there's understanding, there's concern that it's also their history. I know it's a big question, but I want to take this opportunity with you to just ask you how you've been successful at that. It's really storytelling, right? So how do you...
Yeah, it's such an important question, and thank you for asking it, especially because that type of storytelling actually does open up more opportunity for progress. And some of the attacks that we're seeing around the country on actually teaching Black history are a result of the progress that we made. The sort of desire to remove Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and Ruby Bridges from the education of our young people is part of the sort of attempt to actually stop and stall the progress. But when I think about the storytelling that we need, I think we need more storytelling for all of us that help highlight inequality, not as an unfortunate incident, not as some sort of car accident, but as something that is unjust, that we help people underscore sort of all the ways in which there were people, some of them deeply nefarious, and some of them just felt like it wasn't their sort of issue, who stood by or sometimes pushed and made that inequality, made that harm happen. That it didn't just happen, but it was a result of people either remaining silent or people actively putting folks in harm's way. And that the changes that we've seen in this country are as a result of heroes of all races, of all backgrounds, who stood up and pushed for a better tomorrow. You know, sometimes we tell stories about the sort of inequality, and we'll say things like, Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, instead of saying banks are less likely to give loans to Black people. And, you know, people might think that that's semantics, but when we say Black people are less likely to get a loan from the bank, folks ask themselves, well, what is wrong with Black people? Maybe we need financial literacy programs or other programs to help Black people do better inside of institutions which have targeted, exploited, and harassed them and kept them out since the very beginning. And maybe if we say it the other way, banks are less likely to give loans to Black people, we now start having a conversation about what do we need to do systemically about banks. You mentioned the Tulsa riots, and I was just there for the 100th remembrance. And I think about sort of this way in which the community in Tulsa is still dealing with the impact of that. So we don't tell that story about sort of the ways in which that community has not been able to, have everything they want, but we talk about all the ways in which things have been stolen from them. And so that we actually lead ourselves to different solutions. We don't want charitable solutions to problems that are structural. And part of what we have to do is tell new stories and tell stories where new people can be the protagonists, but where all of us have a role. 5, 10, 15 years from now, the world's going to look very different. One way or the other. And I think all of us have a role in playing and making sure that we advance more equity and more opportunity. And I hope people see this Black History Month, but see every single day after that as an opportunity to engage in just that.
I think that line, we don't need charitable solutions for problems that are structural. I tell folks that's a tweetable moment in this conversation today. Rashad Robinson, President of Color of Change, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.